Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Recover You. Patrick, I have a movie quote for you that fits perfectly with today's episode. Guess that movie. Liar, 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 liar. Humpa-dink, humpa-dink, humpa-dink.
I think it's the only movie you know, which is The Princess Bride. I almost said The Princess Diaries. I was like, wait a minute.
I don't know how many times I've quoted that to you, and you're like, what movie is that? So you should be ashamed that that's not the first thing that comes to your mind when I say that.
No, I got it right, didn't I?
Well, today, yeah. Okay, so today we're going to talk about why honesty matters in recovery. Now, this episode flows nicely from last week when we were talking about authenticity. I think they align really well together. I think they're peas in a pod. Yeah. But this particular episode was inspired by a conversation I had with a client, which turned into a TikTok video, which went viral. And that was me sharing that if you are working towards recovery, the number one thing you can do to absolutely destroy your possibility of recovery is consistently keep lying to your spouse.
Right.
And so I thought, it was really popular. Everybody basically agreed. It's one of the biggest things. It's not even because you would think, what's the number one thing? You'd go, oh, relapse. Now, in our situation, my boundary was relapse meant our relationship was over. But a lot of people don't have that. And the thing that will really just destroy the possibility of trusting again faster than anything else is the fact that the betrayer partner or the addicted cannot tell the truth to save their life. And so we're just going to talk about why that's so important to tell the truth and to be honest. And the faster you can get there and the more consistently you can live there, the more likely it is to actually be able to reconcile with your partner. So if that's your goal, keep listening. And then at the end, I have some questions I think are going to be sort of common questions that people have around this topic. And so we'll kind of get to those too. But I thought, let's start with the question about why do people lie?
So, there's you can look at it in two contexts, right? Why do people lie in general? And then why do people lie in the context of sex addiction, right? So I think from a sex addiction standpoint, you lie because you don't want to be found out. You're ashamed of what you've done, or you just don't want to go through the pain of being discovered, right? So you don't want to be you don't want to deal either with the consequences, and so that's pretty common through all lying, right? You just don't want to deal with the consequences. You don't either want to deal with maybe a conflict, whatever that may be. It's like a lot of times parents, you'll get in trouble with your kids will get in trouble with you as parents for doing something wrong. And so in a lot of cases, you got to be careful because it's like there's no incentive to tell the truth because they're going to get in trouble. So, so sometimes with a little kid, you got to really try to think that through. So if the kid comes and actually tells you the truth and they still get in the same amount of trouble than if they you know what I mean? So
so I have a really good example of getting in trouble for lying when I was a kid. So my parents could probably provide a little more context to this, but I think it was that they would periodically, when they hit midlife, they would do different, quote unquote health, trying to get, lose some weight or eat healthier, or they would fast or things like that. And I think what was happening this particular time, and I could be wrong, it could have just been I wasn't supposed to eat candy at church that day. But I think what may have been happening was my parents decided to go on a sugar-free diet for a week, which meant all of us were going to be sugar-free for a week, right? And so I think they, when you go into kids programs at church, they usually give you snacks or candy or, something, right? And so for whatever reason, whatever the context was, that particular week, I was not supposed to have the candy, right? So I come out of Sunday school and I get in the car and I have this little box, and I remember it so well. I don't know what this candy was, but it was in the shape of a thing of grapes. It was this purple clump of grapes, and it was this hard like crunchy candy or whatever. I don't know. And so anyway, so they go, did you eat that? I said no. And here was my workaround. There were some still in the box. I hadn't eaten all of them. I had eaten some of them.
Yeah, good job.
Yeah.
Good job.
So anyway, I had plans with my friend I was very young. I was like, I don't know how old I was, but definitely less than 12. Like I was a kid, right?
Yeah.
So I think I had plans after church to hang out with my neighbor girlfriend. And so I wasn't allowed to do that. So I got punished and I wasn't allowed to hang out with her. And it wasn't because I had eaten the candy. It was because I had lied about eating the candy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so that's just like a really good example of like, you can, however you want to look at the story and however you want to, parent your kids or whatever. But it's an example of how usually people's responses, yes, like when you're talking about sex addiction stuff, yeah, the behavior itself is horrible. That's where the betrayal comes from. That's where the pain comes from, all this kind of stuff. But so much of the pain that these women are experiencing is actually because of the lying that accompanied it. It's the manipulation of like how you engaged in those behaviors was leading this whole other life. And so a lot of times what you see in relationships is not even the mistake, not even the behavior itself. It's the lying, it's the cover up, it's the manipulation, it's the gaslighting, it's the you trying to convince me that the life I'm living is real when it's not, and you're pulling a fast one on me, right? I personally had this, I don't know if it was like the Holy Spirit or just anxiety rooting itself in me very early on as a kid, but I had like this moment when I was a kid where it hit me hard and I was like convicted of lying. And I remember it very distinctly. I was sitting in the bathtub. I mean, like all of these stories I'm telling you today were when I was really young. I was sitting in the bathtub and for whatever reason, I was flooded with guilt for like these little things. And I was like, I have to tell my mom. And like my mom came in, like I'm crying, and I'm like confessing these lies to my mom or like these things, like I have to tell you the truth. And so that was my moment of conviction. But on that line, what was your moment of conviction? Because I think we've talked about this a little bit before. Like, 20 years ago, before we even got together, you weren't super convicted that pornography was infidelity. You weren't conviced that was wrong.
20 years ago when we got together?
No, I said before we got together.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like 20 years ago before we got together. And also with lying, like I don't know that you were super convicted, which is interesting because this kind of came up too after, right? It's like parenting, I was very much like, tell the truth, tell the truth, tell the truth, tell the truth, because you can't trust somebody when they lie to you, and and over and over and over and over. And Keegan was a sneaky kid.
He was a sneaky kid.
So we had a lot of those conversations. Yeah. So then this all happened, right? And then it's like, you've been lying to me too. So I don't think you really had the same level of conviction about lying. I mean, now it goes into addiction. You could have been like totally honest.
Well, I think I did. I absolutely think I did relative to like, there was the addiction part and then there was the rest of my life. Right. And so, in work, if I was going to get in trouble, I would say what I did, like in any situation, like it was all truthful. Right? I didn't have an issue with lying. I didn't have an issue with telling the truth when it came to, hey, how much did you spend on that speaker? You know what I mean? Like, oh, just say it. You know what I mean? And at work, who didn't do this correctly? Oh, I didn't do it correctly. Like I never really had an issue with it. And actually I took some pride in being the person that like when the boss was upset about something, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to tell him that I did it. Right. Because it was like there was a level. And what's interesting is as when I was first discovered and you start to recognize like just how manipulative your patterns are as you're starting to kind of separate from that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I did kind of ultimately get into that stage of like, well, it is what it is, right? So, you'd be like, hey, did you download this? And I'm like, well, yes. You know what I mean? And like, because it was what it was at that point. But it took me a little while to get there. So, I would tell you, it wasn't that I wasn't convicted on lying or not. There was two phases to it.
Do you think outside of your addiction, you were totally convicted that like it's just wrong 100% of the time?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And people at work would get in trouble, if they lied and, they would like, I remember we terminated somebody because they brought in a false doctor's note. right? You know what I mean? And stuff like that. So it's like, there was integrity had has a role in life, and it keeps the fabric together, and it keeps things moving forward, and you know what I mean? And all of those things. Yeah.
It's really interesting to me because you'll see this sometimes where an individual that does lie for whatever reason gets really offended when they're lied to.
Yeah.
Or when they feel like they can't trust somebody.
Sure. Yeah.
But it doesn't always change the behavior.
Yeah. It's, once again, it wasn't
It's like the self-reflection piece though, right? Of
Yeah.
like, hey, I think it's important when we live life, and when like I've talked about this before, when somebody is nice to me, I go, oh, that's really nice. Okay, maybe I should practice doing that to somebody else. And that's like a self-reflection piece of how can I grow to be nicer to somebody? And talking about this is kind of the opposite. It's like, oh, that really hurt. Oh man, I need to be really careful. I never do that to anybody. And I'm not sure that second part always happens.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the reason I want to draw the distinction, because I didn't lie to my employees. I didn't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I didn't, I wouldn't lie about things if we couldn't do stuff, you know what I mean? And like, so, it was only around this particular
topic.
as it related to, which kind of brings up, why was lying so strong in this pattern?
Yeah, because I think you lied both to me and to yourself.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
When you're talking about the addiction aspect, it's very much, we'll see this a lot, and you did this a lot, where it's the qualification of the behavior. It's the lying to yourself so that you don't feel so bad about what you're actually doing, so you don't actually have to like full on 100% face the reality, face the truth, right?
Yep.
So back to the original question, because we really like to get on tangents, why people lie. We've kind of covered that, but I think just to kind of bullet point it, one that we didn't mention was protecting their partner. And I do think that's a little bit of a qualification, but sometimes I think that is sort of sincere in the addict's mind, that it's like, okay, well, I don't want to tell them this because I know that will really hurt their feelings.
Of course. Yeah.
So I do think there's an aspect to which it's a very mixed reasoning there, because part of it is very selfish, but the other part I do think sometimes can be sincere.
I think that's probably why you have a little bit of the trickle disclosure, because you're like, oh my goodness, they just reacted horribly to this piece of news. So why don't I just keep this to myself, because it'll just make them, they're already in crying, and they're already,
I hurt them really badly.
I've hurt them really badly. So I'll just
what
take
if they
this
find
piece.
out more?
Right. Yeah. I'll just take this because now we're on this road to healing. So it's going to be okay. Right. And we'll just, we just won't share everything that comes out.
So I think to protect the partner, and again, that's kind of a mixed bag, but there's diminishing or qualifying their own behavior. So, basically it's to make yourself feel better. I'm going to lie to myself so I don't actually have to face the totality of it. And then I think the third one, which is like obvious and would be just everyone that ever lies about anything, no matter how big or small, is just avoiding consequences, right? Like avoiding the consequences of the behavior. So if you don't find out, no, I'm not going to get in trouble for it, right?
Yeah.
So I did want to bring our faith into this a little bit. I think what we believe as Christians, we believe in the Bible. And, one of the things that I just think is so important about it as a book to live by is that it teaches you how to be a decent human being. And it teaches you how to interact with other people, where you put other people before yourself, where you show up with integrity, where you take responsibility for your behavior. It's really... when you read it in its totality and you look at what Jesus taught, and you look at the 10 Commandments, and you look at God's character, and us, trying to grow in our process of becoming more like Christ and more like God throughout our life, all of those things bring us closer towards authenticity. All of those things bring us closer towards being really empathetic, kind, good people. And so in the context of what we're talking about today, lying is like super prominent as a big no-no in the Bible. And it's not qualified. And Christians will do this too. Christians will sometimes say there's a righteous lie. I don't believe that. I believe that it's wrong to lie no matter what the situation is. And that may be a whole other conversation if people want to kind of go down that rabbit hole. But just so you know where I'm coming from, I don't believe there's ever a quote unquote right or acceptable time to lie. I just don't think those exist. There are times where you can stay silent, you can not say anything at all, but I never think it's the right quote unquote thing to do, to lie. And so we see in the 10 Commandments, it's thou shalt not bear false witness. And so we were looking at that earlier, and I was like, because you always think it's thou shalt not lie, right? But it's actually thou shalt not bear false witness. And so I was kind of looking into like, what does that mean? And I thought it was really interesting because it kind of goes above and beyond lying a little bit. It's like that manipulation piece, kind of convincing other people, manipulating other people, maybe using some truth, but being kind of malicious. Right. And so when you think about that, it's not just lying, right? It's like manipulating other people and being a decent human, right? But then there's this section in Proverbs too, and it has this Proverbs 6:16-19, and it says, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a man who stirs up dissension among brothers. So you have lying twice. You have a lying tongue, and you have a false witness who pours out lies. So when you're listing out things God hates and lying is on there twice, I feel like it's a big deal, right? And so why do you think that? Well, I mean, of all the things, right? Why do you think that would be? Well,
having come from my own journey, I know what it does to you personally when you lie, and the anxiety that you go through as you try to cover for the lie, and the manipulation you feel, and what that does to you as you try to tie all those loose ends together and do all of that. I mean, it is freaking stressful. I mean, you know what I mean? It is an incredibly stressful way to live. So like, if you can think about it just from like your own personal physiology, you know what I mean? It's an incredibly, I guess you could say, harmful thing to the body to be engaged in a lot of manipulation and lies, and it can lead to confrontation, and it can lead to all these things that just from a body standpoint are not healthy for you. So I think that was clearly, it's like the battle with my inner self that was going on as I was trying to, it nearly destroyed me.
Yeah, and I mean, and then like when you're talking about, what the Bible teaches us, right? It's about living in integrity, being honest, being truthful, being loving, but then it's also very much focused on like how to interact in pleasant, healthy, non-toxic ways with other human beings, right? And so what happens when you lie? People figure that out at some point. Like now, if you're a chronic liar, they're going to figure out sooner than later. But if you're lying about your addiction, right, it's you'll figure it out through that process. But what happens is like when they find out that you've done it more than once, trust is like just absolutely destroyed. And so that's what I was talking about in my video that I made. It was basically like it's the number one most destructive thing in reconciliation process, because every single time the addicted lies to the betrayed partner, it takes them back to square one, because you cannot start healing and you cannot start moving forward until you can start building trust. And if you're not being honest, or your partner's not being honest, then you're not going to be able to build that trust. And so every time you think you're starting to lay some bricks down and then you find out another lie, it takes you back to the beginning. And so it just is, and there's only so much of that a betrayed partner can take before they're like, okay, I'm done with this. I just don't trust you. I don't think you're going to change. And I'm not willing to like sit through this anymore.
Yeah. I don't want to sit there and teach you what can be considered a basic thing on how to tell the truth.
Yeah.
I think you even said this when we were discussing the other day, like you, in a weird way through those first, 2 months kind of understood a little bit of the, like trying to keep it from you. And you know what I mean? Like, as I was qualifying things, like I think you had said that the other day. I don't know if understood
I gave you some grace as I began to learn about the addiction process. So the idea there isn't that, oh, I'm okay with you lying to me. It's, okay, I see that you're starting to go through this process, and I'm beginning to understand that lying and manipulation kind of comes within the addict package.
Right.
However, none of it was something I was going to tolerate long term. Right. Absolutely none of it. And I made that super clear. So I wasn't like letting you get away with lies or anything like that, but I was very much like, I would catch you, we would talk about it, whatever. What I mean by giving you a little bit of grace during that period of time is I stuck around, even though there were some ups and downs those first couple months, because I kind of had this idea that like, maybe it was something that we could get through and that would be done, right? And thankfully it was. I think it was maybe about 2 months in that you got to that. Okay, I'll tell you. I remember
there was, through those 2 months, there was a little bit of trauma brain too, and I'd be like, "Wait, what'd I say?" You know what I mean, and stuff like that. So there was, as I was unpacking, and really, one of the four roots of addictive behavior and being in this is denial, right? So there's a lot of denial, and you've got to push through that denial, and that's what can lead to a lot of that lying and manipulation too. Is you're just in a massive amount of denial.
Massive.
Right. And so as you strip down the denial, it starts to become easier to tell the truth.
Okay, what do you think helped you do that? Was it me literally showing you all of these things and wording them in like what everyone else in the world looks at as like, this is black and white. This is what reality is. Let me show you, like, this is what you were doing. And then you go, oh, wow, like that is what I was doing. Or
well, I think it was all three things. I think it was that, as I've mentioned before, it's, the three-legged stool, that it was going and sitting with my therapist and him talking through it, and then sitting in the groups and hearing.
Kind of like hearing it reiterated over and over again.
You sit down through your first group and they talk about denial and binge purge and all the things that you've been doing. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's me. So then it resonates with you. That truth resonates with you as you start to say, hey, I've got to be a better person than I am.
But why do you think you eventually got to the place where you said, okay, I will tell you the truth no matter what the consequences? Because, basically, in this context, in that area, you lied to me for like a decade at least.
Yeah.
So that's a long pattern. So what do you think was like the straw that was like, okay, no matter what?
I think it was like, and I think it goes in a little bit of what I was saying before, like I've always been willing to accept consequences. Like I've never, like when I've been found out or caught or whatever, or I underperformed at work, I don't mind, part of me like prides myself in. So I think there's a little bit of that part of me that was like, well, it is what it is, right? If we're going to break up because I did something, well then, it is what it is. And so I think I got to, and it was really hard. Like it was like, I remember thinking like it's just hard to like figure out like, okay, well, what does she know? What's she going to find out? Like, you know what I mean? Like it was just like, like that, like you having access to my email. Like, I remember I told you, I was like, why didn't I delete those things like 15 years ago? Like, what's wrong with me?
Yeah, I will say through the process, you were a horrible, what do you call it? When you cover up afterwards? Yeah. Like,
but I could have I could have gone to work and deleted all my emails, and I didn't.
You didn't.
You know what I mean? I was like, well, it is what it is. You know what I mean? Like,
do you think that's because there was a part of you that wanted to be found?
Damn the torpedoes. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways, yeah.
Do you think that's because part of you wanted to be found out to an extent where you were like, you wanted to kind of like be forced into the real world?
Well, I think also I knew how broken I was. I really started to get a glimpse of how broken I was, and I didn't want to be broken anymore. And so like, I think I was like, I don't want to be broken anymore. I know this is really hard on you. But I think deep down there was something to me that recognized that this was part of the process. You know what I mean? To kind of get almost like crucified on this, you know what I mean? These things brought to you, and like, look, well, what about this? You did this, or you're like, oh, you know what I mean? And so like,
like you felt like you were accepting your just punishment is kind of what you're saying?
In a way, yeah.
You were kind of like, okay, well,
right.
I'm ready to.
I deserve to be punished,
take the hits.
So let's just be punished, and let's get through it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
And I do want to add that, because I remember you saying early on, like, I robbed you of consent information. And I remember thinking that, like, well, I didn't want to do that. So like, I knew that I could have deleted all those emails, and then we would have never, it would have, but then I would have been like, well, then I would have had to answer for that. And then that would have really driven, you know what I mean? You would have been like, why'd you delete everything? Why would you delete everything now? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and actually I would say the way it happened, as traumatic as it was helpful for me to put the big picture together. And for me, and again, we've talked about this like in the disclosure episodes and stuff, like there's certain details like you never want, right? But for me, having the pieces to the puzzle of like how this progressed and what it looked like and what the patterns were, I think it was actually really, really helpful for me to have that evidence, to see like the emails or the money trail in the bank account and all that kind of stuff, because I could really definitively see patterns of behavior and get like a better understanding, because it was so novel to me. It was so, I was so naive when I started to find out, and that alone was like so traumatic, like ripping the curtain away. But just finding all that, I think, was really ultimately helpful for me to see like the patterning, I guess, and some of like what was real. Yeah. What was actually real.
Right.
What is the thing that you talk about in the groups? I always forget the name of it, where it's like I call it you're between a rock and a hard place.
Oh, it's called a double bind.
Yeah. So that's the idea kind of taking the harder good over the easy evil.
Yeah. So, if you think about it this way, it's easy. In a lot of cases, it's easier to lie, right? If you, and I don't want to. Short term, right? So you just kind of, you don't. But one of the things that the group, the question the group asks of you each time you go is, what was your biggest double bind for the week? And then, have you lied to anybody? And it doesn't say, have you lied to your spouse? Have you lied about sex addiction? It's just, have you lied to anybody? Because when people start to really think about, gosh, did I lie to this person? Did I just tell a story? And I, through the years, you'll hear these things like, I just like to tell funny stories that aren't true. You hear people will say that, and they'll be like, yeah, I lied to my coworker. I told this story. And it's just a pattern. And they're starting to really recognize their overall pattern of not telling the truth.
It's so problematic because like your friends sort of pick that up, and they're like, oh yeah, you can't really, he's funny, but you can't really trust him. You know what I mean? It's literally lying. When people catch on that you've lied to them, it is the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
It really is, because it's like, I want to believe you, but I just can't.
Yeah.
And if you think about reconciliation and any relationship, really, if you want to have a good friendship or a good partnership or whatever, it requires intimacy and vulnerability. Right. And if lies are kind of strewn throughout that, then you're not going to have that, because just like the behavior of addiction itself, lies are anti-intimacy. They push you away from the person trusting you, and they actually inhibit trust.
Well, and you think about when you're telling a story, right, to a friend or whatever, you're maybe you want to come across as more interesting than you think you think you are. So once again, it's not about being seen for who you are. You know what I mean? And stuff like that. Let's go back to the double bind, because we didn't really kind of fully explain that. So I always use this example. So let's say you're working through recovery and you relapse, and there's no way for your wife to find out. Right? So the double bind becomes, and you have an agreement with your wife that if you relapse, you'll tell her within 24 hours. That's a pretty common one.
That's
you hear that.
Super common.
Yeah, you hear that. So now you're in the double bind. There's no way for her to find out, right? There's no way. There's no way for her to prove it electronically, nothing, right? She can't find out. But you've made this agreement to tell her. And so now you're in this double bind. Like, are you going to tell her? Or are you going to keep it? So you think about it, it's where the consequences of either action have an impact, right? Or there is impactful consequences on either decision that you make. One is you are now untruthful to your wife.
And hiding something.
And hiding something. And the other one is you're going to make her upset because you relapsed, right? And you kind of did something that maybe you didn't think you'd do again. So, of course, the right answer there is to always go tell the truth. Always tell the truth.
And that was one of the examples that I gave in my video and I think I mentioned earlier, is that so common. It was not my story, but a lot of women will actually say, listen, I don't want you to relapse, obviously. That's not the goal. But I'm not going to leave if you come and tell me.
Right.
But you have to be honest about it. But if they hide it, that's like another thing in the box of, okay, I can't trust you. I can't rebuild with you.
Right.
I can't live a life with you. Like, this is not safe for me. And that's what recovery for a betrayed spouse is It's really all about building safety. And so if you think about lying, it absolutely destroys that every single time it happens.
I remember there was this, I did a whole bunch of reading when we first, I was literally like blowing through books on sex addiction and strongholds and all of these different things. And I remember I read this one book, and I think I told you the story. It was pretty early on too, but it was about a guy who, he actually had written about sex addiction and written about sex addiction. And he told this story about how this guy had been discovered, and he and his wife were working through this process. And she went somewhere, and he was supposed to take out the trash. So she gets home, she goes in and says, "Hey, did you take out the trash?" And he says, "Yeah, I did." So she goes into the bedroom or the bathroom, and she's brushing her teeth to get ready for bed, and she looks out the window, and he's taking out the trash. And that was the final straw. That was her, and she divorced the guy because at that moment she realized that she could never trust him. So it wasn't necessarily about the trash. Who cares about the trash? It was this straw of them kind of working through all of this pain and this process, and her recognizing, I can't even trust him to tell me about taking out the trash.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And stuff like that.
And that let's just pause there, because that's the whole point.
Yeah.
It's not about the trash.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, if there are men that are trying to get into recovery right now listening to this episode, and reconciliation is your goal, I don't think we can emphasize enough, like, you've got to be honest.
Yeah.
You have to be honest.
Right.
And you have to be honest, like, now.
Yeah.
And you have to do it voluntarily.
Right.
You can't keep, your wife can't keep coercing you or threatening you with boundaries. I don't want to use the word threatening, because boundaries are about our safety. But our safety is impeded when we can't trust you. And so
that's right.
Honesty is a boundary most of the time, like almost every single time. It's like because of that. I can't even trust you to take out the trash. Right. If I can't trust you to take out the trash, then why in the world do I think that you would be honest with me about a relapse? And if I can't know that you're in sobriety, what are we even doing here?
Right.
Like, that's the whole point. That story is such a good story. But that's not the only one. That happens all the time. It happens all the time. There is another, and this is not exactly about lying per se, but it's just, I heard a story one time that was like, when did you know your relationship was over? And the wife said, well, my husband used to always refill like the type of cereal that I wanted. I think they kept them in like these containers or whatever, like these plastic containers with the label on it or something like that. And so he would always buy a new box and fill it up, and buy a new box and fill it up, like this kind of granola or cereal or whatever. And that was like the little love language, right? Of like, like he's thinking of me. And, even if they were fighting or whatever, he'd always buy the extra and fill it up when he'd notice when she was going low. She goes, the day I knew our relationship was over was when the box was empty. She thought, oh, maybe he forgot. Maybe he didn't notice that it was empty. And a couple days go by, and it was never refilled again.
Yeah.
And that's the point. It's not everybody's like, oh, well, I didn't relapse. It's not about that. I mean, it is.
Right.
But the little things matter. And I don't even want to call lying a little thing, but what you're talking about, like with the trash can, right? Like someone could perceive that as little. It's not little. Well, it is actually everything.
Yeah. I think what you can say is like, there are lies that have little consequence as far as the details surrounding it versus others. So like whether the trash gets taken out or not, is you can almost argue is very inconsequential.
You could say that maybe in like a normal life, but I think after betrayal, it really doesn't matter whatever you would consider in quote unquote regular life, big or little. I think it's all big. That's kind of the point. It doesn't really matter. It is big. It's huge at that point, because it's about the rebuilding of trust. And without that, what do you have? Nothing. Yeah.
And, I was actually, this thought just came to mind as we're talking about it. So if every time you tell the truth, you lay a brick down around you, right? You start, each time you tell the truth on everything, you're building a stronghold around yourself that protects you from, because things are going to get hard. Those double binds could get really, really difficult, right? So if you've gone into a practice of telling the truth and putting a stronghold around the truth and integrity in your life, then you can withstand it, versus every time you tell a lie, you take a brick off of that stronghold, right? And it just gets lower and lower and lower, and then you're left with no defenses, right? So I often think about lying or telling the truth and being in integrity can be as if you're protected. and not.
You're talking about the individual themselves telling the truth. Yeah,
right,
I would take that same analogy and go, every time you lie, you're building. You're putting a brick in the wall in between you and your partner, and so it's becoming a thicker, taller wall for her to overcome in order to trust you again.
Yeah, right. It's interesting. You get into these, and then you and I have talked about this, like, are you just saying that I'm pretty because you don't want me to leave you or whatever, you know what I mean? Like stuff like that. And I'm like, no, because and there are some people that I think sometimes people
bluster about that stuff.
Yeah, people may be like, well, my wife didn't really look good in that dress, but I just told her she looked good. And so, those are, the thing is you don't have to be mean. I think sometimes people are like, well, I told the truth. I say, well, you look fat and ugly.
Well, think about it this way.
It's like, well,
no, you don't have to be mean to
somebody.
somebody.
You look better in that other dress.
You know what dress I really love?
Right, exactly. I like it.
You look great today. Yeah. That may be a different outfit.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what looks good when you wear your hair up or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But what I mean, think about that too. It's like, okay, I ask you sometimes, because I don't always wear liquid eyeliner, but sometimes I do, and it's kind of hard. Your eyes are not perfectly symmetrical, right? And your face isn't always perfectly symmetrical.
Yeah.
So making it look perfectly symmetrical with makeup sometimes is hard, right? So I'll be like, are these even? Like, if you lied to me about that, and I go out and it's totally lopsided, and it doesn't have to be perfect when you tell me, yeah, it looks good, but you say, yeah, no, it looks fine, then I'm like, okay, are you sure? Look at the, and I'll kind of ask you. But if you were to, and I go out and I trusted that, and then I go out and I'm like, oh my gosh, one is 3 times as big as the other one.
One was red and one was green or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what's that going to do? But if I am a little bit off and you go, hey, this one's just a little bit off, it's a little bit longer than the other one or whatever you might say, that if I could believe that you're going to be honest with me about that,
right,
then what else am I going to start trusting you on?
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so it doesn't have to go, oh my gosh, it looks horrible. That's not, you go, oh yeah, this one's a little bit shorter than the other one, or, or whatever. Or this outfit might be a little, I know it's like a cocktail hour, it's a little more dressed up, or, different things. But you can, it's who do you want to be? Right. Honestly, in life,
Well, I think for the addicts who are going through this process, You've lied to yourself. You've lied to your spouse if you're married. You've lied to others about your behavior. Now you got a chance. You got a chance to finish differently than how you started or how you got into. And one of the best ways to fall back on it may not be about how many groups you run, or it may not be about how many books you write, or how great you are at therapy, or you won the trophy for being the best therapist patient in the history of the planet. What really you can take with you is your integrity, because that's how people view you. So, like with anything, it's like all of us make mistakes. All of us do things in our past that maybe we're not proud of. But starting today and starting, this evening or whatever it is, you can start to change that around. And a day turns into 2 days, turns into a month, turns into 6 months. And the next thing you know, you're living in integrity. So it's not too late, I think is the point.
Speaking of living in integrity, what is the benefit of being honest and living in integrity?
Well, I would say, like I mentioned before, the drawback to lying, you are who you are, right? I noticed it physiologically when I just started telling the truth. You know what I mean? Like as much as early on as I was ashamed, my whole body just calmed down, right? So individually, my whole body calmed down. I don't know if I was sleeping better initially because of everything that was going on, but I mean, I was just, it was who I was. And so
you had done what you had done. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I had done what I had done. And so I felt better emotionally and physically, even though I was kind of dealing with some hard things with you and I. The second thing is I would say is knowing, like this, we told the story in an earlier podcast how the polygraph got a little squonky, you know what I mean? And you said something to me, and this kind of shows you the benefit of really putting in the work. And you said, hey, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, right?
Before you even went into it.
Before I even went into it, right?
Because you said, well, what if something happens or something weird happens? And I was like, well, I think at this point I give you the benefit of the doubt. And then something weird did happen, which is kind of like, But But as we talked about it, I was like, oh, actually, I think you were it sounds the way you were describing it, like you were trying to tell the truth and the whole truth, not that you were trying to manipulate some sort of lie in the middle of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that, the work I had done up to that point helped us get through that. Had I still been lying to you and all of this stuff, it would have made that whole situation worse.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
You know what I mean? And
we were 3 years in and you were still lying to me. And then you failed a polygraph, I think we'd be done.
Yeah.
I don't even know if we would have gotten to this point.
Right. And so, and the other thing I've thought about, with this too is Keegan. So Keegan's at a school right now, a college that has a very strict honor code. And so much so that people get kicked out for it. They have investigations and all of these different things. And I think a lot of colleges do, but this one's very, very serious. And so, being able to talk to him like that without feeling like a fraud, so those are all really, really important things. But I think where you and I are, as far as, I don't think we'd be where we are, and we mentioned this before, but we would not be here if I was still lying to you, if I was still, half truths and gaslighting and stuff like that. We just wouldn't be here the way we are.
No, so I think summarizing sort of, I think you pretty much said this. People love you for who you are. So how do you know that if you're lying to everybody, right? And the ultimate goal in life is to connect with people. It's like what we're designed to do is to connect and have community. And that's a lot of times what people are missing. And part of the reason they go into addiction is they feel alone when they're surrounded by people. And so learning how to actually have intimate conversations with people, learning how to be vulnerable, you can't do that when you're lying to them, right? And so, when you show up in a truthful way, you end up having deep relationships with people. And you can kind of rest in the fact, hey, they actually like me for who I am. And I think that's something you've experienced too through this process. You're like, hey, all my friends actually really like me for who I am, maybe even more so now that I'm being honest.
Right.
Yeah. As opposed to what you had been afraid of forever, which is I'm going to be rejected and alone forever. And so I think that's the ultimate outcome of truth. People are attracted to that. They want to be with that. Even if it's an uncomfortable truth, that is attractive. And because they know they can trust you, which is the second thing.
So let me ask you something. So when did you feel internally like I was starting to tell the truth and that it was starting to be consistent? Do you remember that?
It was around 2 months in.
So that 2 months you felt...
I think that you said, I will tell you whatever. And then I could test that, right?
Yeah.
Because then you would start actually answering the hard questions with hard answers.
Right. Yeah. Now, how did you know, how do you think it was reinforced? Because it wasn't always, we very quickly moved off of sex addiction questions. You know what I mean? I would say, post discovery or disclosure and things like that. How did you, for the spouses that are out there and working with their,
because I did actually keep asking you questions for a long time. I mean, probably the first at least a year and a half, when I would get triggered or whatever, I would have a question for you about something, and you would answer uncomfortable questions with uncomfortable answers. Yeah. And so I think that over time, the more you did that, the more I was like, okay, you're being for real. And then eventually we've talked about this too, where it's okay, I started to shift. I'm going to tell you more about how I feel versus the triggering question that I have, because sometimes the question is helpful and sometimes it's not. So over time, and as safety is established, you sort of figure out discernment in that area, and you shift the way you're asking the question. But
or you make it more a statement. So here's a good example. You say, hey, what did you say? Versus hey, the thought of you saying things hurts my feelings.
No, yeah, I still will say that sometimes. Every once in a while I'll be yep, that's still.
Yeah, so that's a good example where it's not hey,
this
what
thing
did you say?
Today.
I want a transcript, all of these different things.
Or I'll say, this thing happened today and it kind of reminded me. And I'll also talk about the veil. The more that we've gotten into recovery, there's a veil that I feel is in my brain maybe, where I go, I can think about this and not feel triggered. There are some days where the veil is totally down though. So if I'm exposed to something, I'm more susceptible to feeling the emotion of the pain again.
Right.
And so I think just in case anybody's listening, that's normal. But as you heal, that becomes less and less and less and less. The veil stays up. And I think a lot of things are probably associated with that.
And things like that.
No, I mean, I think a lot of things are associated with the veil coming down, hormone fluctuations, fatigue, maybe extra stress 1 week or lack of sleep or things like that.
Yeah.
Leave it more susceptible to you being more sensitive to different things. But the healing is what puts the veil up in the first place, which is what I think you were just saying. So yeah, I think the benefit of living in integrity, people love you for who you are, people can trust you. And then you were talking about, you can trust yourself. And more than that, you can begin to like yourself. Because one of the biggest beliefs that addicts have is like they really don't like who they are. They don't think they're worthy of anything. And so I think as you sort of live into the identity of the person that you want to be, you start to like yourself more. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's a journey. Once again, to the addict out there, that's not a 2-month thing.
Yeah.
It still comes up in me. Sometimes there's times where I will feel bad about myself, and I'll still kind of take on that sense of being unloved and stuff like that. But it's so few and far between, and it doesn't go deep. A lot of times it used to go really, really deep, and occasionally it'll pop, and then you kind of go, oh, okay, that's what I'm feeling, because you try to stay connected to your feelings, and then you kind of, which is also another important thing. So like in the groups when you ask, did you lie to anybody, and the guy goes, yeah, I think I lied to my dad last week. I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Yeah. Why did you lie? So it goes to the
motivation,
right? Yeah. It goes to the root of some of these like traumas. It might be, well, my dad beat me one time. Like, oh, okay. Well,
I think you're afraid.
Yeah. Right.
I think to answer your question about what was your question about? It was how I learned to trust you or something?
Yeah, how it felt. Like, because obviously we go off of our feelings. And so, like, when do you think you started to feel like, hey, I think I can start to trust him?
Well, feelings is different because logically I could tell within that first 2 months because you made that decision and then you're answering the questions, right? But are you asking more about like the trust aspect of it?
Yeah.
Like the deep trust? Mm-hmm. Oh, that was probably maybe 2 years in.
Okay.
I mean, it was building that whole time, but to really sit in it, probably over 2 years.
Yeah. And that's important to say that because the people that are listening to this thing, you'll hear, a lot of times you'll hear.
Or I guess to say to trust that feeling of trust. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. You'll hear a lot of addicted spouses say, well, my wife still doesn't trust me. And it's been 3 months. And it's been, and it just takes time. And it's just anything.
No. If you're talking about like a deep level of trust, somewhere between the 2 and 3 year mark, probably for me. I mean, not that there were huge steps along the way of like jumping up to another level. And the thing is that I cognitively, like logically believed that you were sincere, but the feeling and the depth of the trust and believing that it was going to last, that like took a really long time for me to actually go, okay, I think this is for real. I think it's going to be long term. You're proving it. It's consistent. There's no relapsing. Okay, I can trust this trust, if that makes sense.
And then actively throw in there, had I been actively lying to you? Where
oh my gosh, I'd be out. Yep. Right. So, okay, let's wrap it up and we can answer these kind of quickly, but there's a couple questions I think people might have sort of around this topic. So the number one question that I wrote down is, how much grace do you give as they get into recovery? So I think we sort of touched on that earlier. And what I would say is you will get an idea very quickly. Like our example is 2 months. Maybe it's somewhere between 2 to 6, but I would say like well before you hit a year, you should have a good idea of, as long as you've been connected to the right resources. Let me just put that caveat in there, because I do run into a lot of people that will go through like some sort of discovery and then they connect with like marriage therapists and they just like run around in circles and feel like they get blamed, and then they're feeling frustrated and they're not feeling like their husband's doing the work, and they're not connected to actual like therapeutic disclosure process and a polygraph and like that. And that's why those are so important. And so I would say like if since the period of time that you've been connected to those things and he's had the real resources to help him get out of denial and to like address it as addiction and that sort of thing, since that period of time, well within a year of that period of time, less than a year, like my guess would be like 3 to 6 months would be kind of a good period of time to say like, you're going to know if he's sincere. It's not that he's going to be perfect during that time. You definitely weren't. And that's what we were just kind of talking about. You were kind of getting out of addict brain, but that's kind of what I meant by like giving grace, is like, I kind of understood when you're connected to that, you're going to be with a good coach or a good therapist. It's like, okay, this is sort of the process. This is what their brain's going through. You can kind of know that like this pattern is common. But if you're like over a year, they've gone through disclosure, they've gone through a polygraph, that sort of thing, and they're relapsing a lot or they're lying to you all the time, like, okay, that's when you have to ask, what are you willing to tolerate long term? Because now this is a long-term problem. And if they have the resources and, they have the recovery tools and they're not using them, that's a different story.
Right.
Okay, question number 2, how honest? When you say honest about everything, how honest? Right.
Yeah.
So I say in a healthy, non-toxic relationship, you don't have secrets. I actually would bring this around to say, you've learned more about me in the past 3 years because as we've gone through this, I've gone, okay, well, he's being super vulnerable and I'm demanding full transparency. I have to be fully transparent too.
Right.
And so as that trust was rebuilt and stuff, I mean, I would think you would agree, but I've brought more towards that myself. Not that I had lied before, but just even being, or like was lying all the time or whatever, but just even being more forthcoming and more vulnerable and more like that. I think you've learned more about me because of that.
Actually, if I could add in there too, I think sometimes what'll happen is the betrayer will say, well, I was honest here and they blew up at me. Your honesty is not tied to the reaction of the other person. Your honesty is tied to what you are bringing to yourself. If you're giving bad news, like, yes, you're right, I had an affair with your sister, she's allowed to be upset at you. You know what I mean? Like she is. So what you got to be really careful of, and I'm not going to talk to the betrayed, how they should react. That's not my lane. But when you're the addict and you're trying to come clean, you still do have to remember that some of what you say could be hurtful and be prepared for that. But also understand that by telling the truth, what's the classic thing? The truth will set you free. It really does. You don't carry these things with you, these deep, shameful things. You start to resolve this stuff that is out there that you can.
Well, I think to that point,
close.
The truth will set you free. You really kind of have to ask yourself at some point, would I rather be alone? I mean, and by alone, I mean not married. Would I rather be divorced and have a community and all this kind of stuff and have all these friends that actually know who I am? And like, I know that I am living authentically and living in integrity and being honest 100% of the time? Or would I rather be married and constantly live in shame and guilt and trying to manipulate and which is over time abusive to your partner? Is that the person that I want to be?
Right.
Or not? Because if that's not who you want to be, then start telling the truth.
Yeah,
and start telling the truth today.
Yeah.
Because then you're either going to end up alone and happy with who you are as a human being, and I shouldn't use the word alone because you'll build the community of people who care about you, but divorced, or your wife will see that, love that, and stay with you, and you'll have a better marriage than you could ever possibly have if you stay down the route of lying and manipulating. So when you say how honest, I say no secrets. There's a difference between secrecy and privacy. No secrets, no white lies, nothing hidden.
Yeah.
Like if you actively have something hidden other than like a surprise birthday party that they'll find out about, you should not have things that are hidden from your partner. Okay, and then the third and final question, honest about what? When you say your partner should be honest about what? And here's my answer, literally everything.
Yeah. I mean, what would you not be honest about? What would you... and you're right. There could be some timing things like a birthday party, or maybe you're afraid because you're going through a diagnosis or something.
But even
like
then,
that.
I think it's be careful, right? Like, do you think it's okay to lie about a birthday party? Right? You can keep it a little private secret to surprise them. But like, what if you're directly asked, like, "Hey, are you planning a surprise party for me? Do you think that's okay to lie about that?" I don't, let's think about this here, okay?
I think...
is that an agreed upon thing in your relationship where it's like, hey, I give you permission to like, as long as you tell me afterwards?
Maybe that's the thing. Maybe you kind of talk through that stuff. But, I would say if you're planning a surprise birthday party, you can really... You need to be prepared, right? Don't go into a whole stream of lying over that. Because actually, I tell you what, if you're going through a recovery program, that could derail.
Oh, 100%.
It really could. And so you got to be careful.
That's actually a really good example because that's something that somebody could go, oh, this is totally innocent. But then it triggers old patterns.
Yeah, maybe the person was going places that they were like not telling them about. And it didn't make sense.
And whether or not it's triggering to the addict, if the spouse found out that there was actually a series of untruths over the past month as you were hiding, and she said, hey, who are you on the phone with? And you go, oh, that was just work. And then she's like, oh, actually, like you were planning a birthday party. Something that you intended for good could be like really detrimental to the recovery process. So, I mean, actually, I think that's a really good thing to bring up.
Well, here's something that, you think about it. So you have access to all my emails and stuff like that around Christmas time, like I just
You don't hide it.
The emails
I
come
just
in, whatever,
intentionally
and-
go, okay, if I don't want to know what my Christmas present is, I'm not going to go into his email like in the month of December, or I'm going to look less at Amazon order history.
Right,
Like,
right, yeah. And I don't hide it. I don't delete it. I don't do anything.
Right.
I'm like, it is what it is.
Because I think that's actually a really good example of that agreement. Okay, so honest about what, my answer is literally everything. But I think it goes beyond, okay, hey, Patrick, I asked you a question and you lied about it. It's being forthcoming, and this is like a huge thing in the betrayal community. It's the forthcoming, it's the proactiveness. Mm-hmm. That it's not just, okay, I haven't lied. It's how forthcoming are you, right? And so through recovery, you start to be more proactive about sharing things about your vulnerabilities, your fears, your insecurities, your triggers, relapses, if that's part of the story, or your recovery process. Like sometimes women ask about, like, is it normal that he doesn't want to tell me anything at all that has ever happened in his therapy session? And my answer is no. Yeah. Because you like, maybe not, he may not want to share every detail of everything that he's talking to his therapist about, but he should be able to keep you in the loop of his recovery process and tell you, like, this is what I'm learning, and this is what we're processing, and this is how he's helping me with my traumas. And again, that's part of the recovery of getting out of the lying and into the honesty and the vulnerability and bringing you into the circle. If a betrayed partner feels like she's being left out of the circle as he goes to recovery, that's not working towards reconciliation. Yeah. That will do absolutely nothing to help you build trust. You're just pushing her further and further and further away.
And I think you learn to, when you're in recovery, so like I'm just completely hypothetical. Your therapist says, hey, we're going to do 3 sessions, and I'd really like for you not to go home and share this with your wife. I'd like for you to think through it. I don't know what that would be. I'm just being purely hypothetical. It's okay to say to your wife, hey, listen, I'm working through something. My therapist has asked me not to share with you until we get through this so I can process and then go from there. So another good example would be, sometimes people are slower processors, right? Hey, what's wrong with you? I don't know. What's wrong with you? Nothing. I don't think anything's wrong with me, right? But then it takes you a little bit of time. It's okay over time as you learn to go, listen, I don't know what's wrong with me right now. Can you give me a little space to kind of work through it, and then I'll come back to you and I'll let you know when I figure it out. That's different than being like, nothing's wrong with me, leave me alone, I never want to talk to you. You know what I mean? So
I actually want to go back to the therapy analysis or the example, because I actually the only situation I think that would typically happen is when somebody is working through creating the disclosure process, and they go, hey, but their only goal there is to avoid the trickle disclosure. Right. But in that situation, he would come home and go, hey, we're working on the disclosure. Right. I'm not going to tell you the details because that's what's going in the disclosure. Yeah. Outside of that, though, like, I actually don't believe in closed therapy sessions. That's my personal opinion. People can have different opinions to that. But I don't believe that in a recovery, because of everything that we're talking about, the importance of honesty and building trust in your partner and them really believing that you're not hiding things from them. I personally don't believe it's ever a good decision to not have open therapy sessions. And what I mean by that is that the spouse should always be able to come back and share at least like bullet points of like, and voluntarily, not that you're coercing it out of them. This is what I'm learning. And that's another good sign too. Like, I want to share with you.
This is the trauma that I process.
I want to share with you like what it is that I'm learning. Like, he wants to bring you in. That is a good sign that he's actually doing recovery. And then the other thing, the other side to that is the addicted partner giving the betrayed partner access to the therapist by signing a release of information. And that just means that the betrayed partner is allowed to like email the therapist, for example, and say, hey, like, this is what's going on. Could you maybe give me some insight? Is this stuff that you're talking about or not? Or sometimes I'll say like, partners will be having this like recurring issue. And when they have access to the therapist, I'll say, hey, like, why don't you go ahead and email the therapist? Just let them know from your perspective that this is what's happening. And then that way, when your spouse goes in, that's something that they can address and make sure it's getting addressed. And so I personally, and again, people can have different opinions about this, but I think when it comes to recovery, the opposite of addiction and shame and all this kind of stuff is total honesty. And so I don't believe in like your recovery therapy being like this big secret. I really don't. Yeah. All right. Anything else you have to say about honesty or lying or the importance of that in reconciliation?
No, I think the only thing I would finally say is just Remember, telling the truth is about you living into being the most authentic view of yourself, like you said at the very beginning. And so if you can learn how to do that, your relationships themselves will become much more rich. You will still have to work through the damage that you have created.
Yeah.
You'll still have to do that. And it could lead to some hard times, but it's made immeasurably harder if you can't tell the truth.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's like you don't start telling the truth and all of a sudden, congratulations for telling me the truth after like a decade, right? Like, yeah, you get to, it takes time. And we reiterate that all the time. It takes a lot of time to rebuild. You cannot, this is not an overnight thing. But again, who do you want to be at the end of the day? Do you want to be somebody that people can trust? Or do you want to be known as somebody that, is constantly untrustworthy? And so that's the point. That is the benefit of honesty and living in integrity. Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.